But the cornerstones of his pyramid of success: industriousness and enthusiasm. Do you love what you're doing, and are you willing to work at it? And that's what I love to do. I love my job. I love my life. I love being alive, and I'm willing to work at it because I know the difference between being on top and being on the bottom, and I want to be on top.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales. Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friends. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman, and on this podcast, we deliver ideas and insights from leaders across the construction industry and beyond every single week to help you lead more effectively. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Capital One Trade Credit. If you're interested in growing your top-line revenue while decreasing risk, you'd be interested in investigating Capital One Trade Credit. Today's episode is the fourth and final installment from our involvement with the WCLBMA's annual convention. That's a lot of letters smashed together. Let's break it down. That is the West Coast Lumber and Building Material Association. It was held in San Diego at the end of October. And for the last few episodes, you have heard a panel discussion with Mr. Matt Saunders, who is moderating. He's from the John Burns Real Estate Consulting firm. And then we had Mr. Steve Patterson of Central Valley. We had Mr. George Emerson of Sierra Pacific. We had Mr. Steve Swanson from the Swanson Group. And we had Mr. Victor Fresca from Dixie Line Lumber. We followed that up with a discussion on talent and retention and building the strongest teams with Miss Ricka Brandon. And then the last episode was the keynote from none other than Mr. Bill Walton, one of the greatest college and NBA players of all time, played for John Wooden at UCLA, was part of the 88-game winning streak, won 2 national championships, then won an NBA championship with the Trailblazers. That's like impossible. No one's ever done that again. And also won a 1986 NBA championship with the Boston Celtics. So you heard the keynote last time, and then we followed that keynote up with a one-on-one discussion with me. That was an absolute blast. So we covered some different topics. Bill and I dug deeper into a couple topics that he talked about in his book, Back from the Dead, which I would strongly recommend to a friend. And there's always that risk when you meet one of your heroes that they will not live up to the expectations that you've got in your mind. However, every now and then, these individuals exceed it. And that was my experience with Mr. Bill Walton. He was incredibly generous. He was thoughtful. He was funny. He came the night before his keynote, and that was not in the contract, just to hang out and get to know the people. And he was talking some smack to me, which was hilarious and crazy at the same time. And then he completely agreed to record video and audio. So we will be putting up the video of my conversation with Mr. Bill Walton on YouTube. And we'll share that with all WCLBMA members. So bottom line, he was generous, he was smart, and in a not insignificant way, he changed my life. So it was a blast. That's what you're going to hear today. My conversation one-on-one with NBA legend, Mr. Bill Walton. As always, thank you for listening. Mr. Bill Walton, welcome.
General, my name is Bill. I'm from San Diego. I have 2 L's in my name. The second one is silent. And what a privilege to be on your podcast here. You are owed nothing. Deliver value first. And that is a mantra that we can all live by, because when we come in with a sense of entitlement, it's not going to happen. You got to come in on edge. You got to come in hungry. You got to come in basically with the opening line to the song is, I'm going to tell you how it's going to be. And this sense of leadership that we're doing with your fantastic podcast is based on all the elements that I've tried to incorporate in my life and that I picked up from all the people who have had such an influence on me, because I am the luckiest dude on earth. And one of the things that we start with when we talk about leadership, and that's responsibility and accountability. And so as a leader, you've got the group there that you're responsible for, that you're accountable for. You need to be able to illuminate the path forward and tell everybody where we're going and why we're going there, how we're going to get there, and what it's going to look like when we do get there. And then you have to never ask anybody, never, to do something that you haven't already done or aren't willing to do yourself. You have to, as a leader, have the ability to pull the team together, to define the terms of the conflict, make them play your game, do what others can't and won't do, lead the relentless offensive attack. Offense wins. You hear all this nonsense on television about defense. Everybody plays defense. You gotta score to win. You gotta lead on. You gotta play offense. And then you have to assume and embrace and learn to love the fact that risk and doubt and hesitation, indecision, uncertainty, and abject failure are all part of every endeavor you're ever going to be a part of. There's no guarantees out there. The leader has to be able to powerfully use the word no. When the leader can say no and does, and the team still buys in, that's when things really come together. And then finally, when it does go wrong, and it will. When it does go wrong, it's the leader's fault. And that guy has to be held accountable and responsible and pay the consequences. Actions, words, they all carry responsibility and consequences.
So you gave a fantastic keynote and you covered a lot of territory. I wanted to kind of zero in maybe on some books that have shaped your life. I understand your mother was a librarian and
I'm a very avid reader. Okay. And the leadership books that I start with, I read a lot.
Like what? What can you give me some?
I read nonfiction.
Okay.
I read history. I study greatness. Okay. I like adventure stories, exploration, experimentation. We grew up in a house without a TV. We couldn't afford one at the beginning. And then when my parents finally saved enough, we had nothing, but we really had everything.
Yeah.
We had a family. We had a community. We lived in a great, fantastic environment and culture, La Mesa, California, 1 block from the San Diego city line. Fabulous schools, teachers, coaches, community, everything. But when my parents finally saved enough, because we were relentlessly pressuring them, get a TV. We want to be cool. We want to be like everybody else. Right. So one night at dinner, my mom, who was in charge of the finances, because my dad had zero interest in money. My dad, he just loved people. He loved life. He loved helping people. He was a social worker and he's an adult educator and he was a music teacher. And so my mom, at dinner one night, announced that we'd saved enough money. We're like, yeah, we're going to get a TV. But then she dashed our hopes, dreams, and aspirations in her next comment when she said, but I've been doing lots of research at the library, and I've concluded that there's nothing on television worth watching, so we're not going to get one. We had books, we had the radio, we had music, and I had a basketball, a bike, and a skateboard, and that was my life growing up. But reading all these different books, I can happily send you my book list, but some of the books that I start with for leadership, Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, Believer by David Axelrod, Bill Graham Presents, and My Life In and Out of Rock, Gene Case, Be Fearless, and then A Generous Nature, Marcy Cottrell Houle, an Oregon State grad and biology professor who wrote this incredible history of Oregon and people like in Gene Case's Be Fearless, people who had no chance at success. One person against the world, one person against the onslaught of absurd nonsense and insanity, right? But one person would stand up, and very much like Ken Burns' series on the national parks. Right? Because if you're not there, if you're not involved in the fight for the national parks, you just sort of think that, okay, this makes all kinds of sense in the world. Of course, this is a national park, but it's not that way. And it was invariably one person who was there, and that was A Generous Nature, which is the story of Oregon's history. And I've got great affinity for Oregon, and so many different books. And I will send you the list.
Okay.
I keep an active reading list, and I'm finishing up right now How the World Really Works, and it's a history of how things go forward, and in our efforts to decarbonize our energy system, and how difficult that's going to be, but. Everything is difficult. As soon as you find something that's easy, you let me know. Yeah. Everything is difficult, if not impossible, until you do it. and one of the things that's amazing in my life is that all the struggles, all the battles that we're involved with, and you go on and say, well, why don't we do it this way? And somebody will say, oh, we can't do it this way. Well, why not? Because we've never done it that way. We've never done it any other way. Yeah. And then as soon as you do something else, you say, well, why didn't we do this from the beginning? So common sense and human decency, kindness, equal protection, equal enforcement, those are all the things that I'm into. And so, I grew up in a fantastic culture with parents with zero interest in sports, but they were interested in life and culture and education. And so my parents, they encouraged me to be curious, to experiment, and to explore. And so much of my exploration as a child was through books and through radio and music ultimately. And then, I found Chick Hearn on the radio when I was 9 years old. Yeah. And it was 1961, and Chick had just come to the Lakers. And from then on, oh my gosh, because while a lot of the musicians will talk about the influence that Bob Dylan had on all of them and all of us, and I concur wholeheartedly in that Bob expanded our horizons and made us think beyond the narrow confines of our own individual life. Well, that was Chick Hearn for me too. And so, Bob Dylan, Jerry Garcia, Neil Young, John Fogerty, Jimmy Cliff, Jackson Brown. It's an endless list. The musicians are still out there all the time. Right. But then that incredibly powerful voice that was Chick Hearn on the radio, and then Vin Scully in the summertime, because he was the Dodgers broadcaster. Sure. But in the summertime, I grew up outside. We had a house, but I was only in there when I was going to bed. Yeah. And so, I've learned over the course of my life that not everybody has a house. And, in the NBA changed everything for me, because that really broadened my horizons, in that, because everybody that I grew up with, they had great parents, great schools, a home in a community. Right. It was fantastic. Growing up here in San Diego, we thought the world was perfect. Yeah. And, if the Pilgrims had landed over here at Point Loma, everything over there east of here would be wilderness. Yeah. But Spencer Haywood, and read his phenomenal book called The Rise, the Fall, the Recovery. Spencer Haywood grew up without a house. He was basically a slave. Mississippi. Yeah. And, they're living outside. The family is. No house, no shelter. They live between the cotton fields on one side, where they worked in the daytime, and then the dump on the other side. And the dump is where they got their stuff, including their food. If they were lucky, they could kill a skunk. They could kill a possum to eat that, but they were eating the scraps and living off everybody else's trash. And then one day Spencer was going from one cotton field to another, and there was a dirt field, a dirt basketball court, where some older people were playing basketball. Yeah. And Spencer, he didn't have any shoes. He just had a pair of cutoff jeans or shorts or whatever, and he's walking from the job and one field to the next, and he sees these guys playing basketball, and he's standing there. Here's this big dude, Spencer Haywood, no shoes, no shirt, nothing except his cutoffs. And they said, hey, why don't you come play with us? And so Spencer gets out there, never seen basketball before, gets out there and just starts throwing it down and blocking shots and killing everybody, right? And that day, somebody from Chicago was there and saw this. And when the game was over, he walked up to a young Spencer Haywood and said, young man, you should come with me and let me take you to Chicago. And from Spencer Haywood today changed the game, and he's in the Basketball Hall of Fame deservedly.
So you had recommended 3 books from our previous call. I have all of them, and maybe you can just give context to one of them. That was Spencer Haywood's book was one. Bill Russell's book,
Go Up for Glory.
Go Up for Glory. And the third one, which I want to ask you about, you strenuously recommended I read it. One of my favorite authors, David Halberstam, was his The Longest Winter.
Oh my gosh. Have you read it yet?
I have not. The greatest leadership book I've ever read was his The Best and the Brightest, which
fantastic.
That's an entire MBA course in, 600 pages.
But all of his books are like that. And I've read them all with the exception of The Breaks of the Game.
Too close?
It was too close. It was too personal. And the sadness. Because while the Blazers were as high as I've ever been, and I love being high, but the fact that I love being the champion.
Sure.
I love being the best. And we were. And then it all fell apart.
Quickly.
And it was sad. And David, who knew Jack Ramsey, was in Portland the day it all fell apart.
Wow.
And so he said, there's a story here. And so he spent years putting the breaks of the game together. I have tried to read that probably a dozen different times. I can't get through the first chapter. It's just too sad because it was so special. It was so perfect. And I want to remember those times as opposed to the sadness of something falling apart. But generally what happens when you have success, and this is where leaders come into prominent display responsibility and the anticipation, because the great leaders, they anticipate what's going to happen. And what keeps teams, companies, cultures from succeeding constantly is, number one, health. You got to maintain your health. And particularly in sports, which it fades so quickly in one injury, a series of injury. But then equally as important is the selfishness that comes in when you in a group dynamic, and all of a sudden, and the group's success is built on sacrifice, discipline, and honor, culture, foundation, leadership, teamwork, visions, goal. But when you have people who come in and you may have achieved success, and that would come from one path and commitment and dedication and determination and sacrifice, discipline, and honor. Then all of a sudden people start thinking, well, you know what? Where's mine? This is about me. And we're winning because of me instead of we're winning because of us. And when that comes in conjunction with guys not being able to stay healthy because the grind, and just like with me, it was the genetics, the birth defects that I had. I've had lots of injuries, but so much of the constant sidelining for me. I spent half my adult life in the hospital. I've had 39 orthopedic operations. Both my ankles are fused. Both my knees are replaced. My hands and wrists don't work. My spine has been replaced and restructured and rebuilt. And so much of all of that can be traced back to the structural congenital defects in my feet, which they never really knew until it was way too late. But there was this one special doctor in Whittier, California, Bill Wagner, who saw it, who knew it, and he tried to fix me. I had a lot of operations with him, a lot. He had invented this one surgery that I had once on each foot, and it had never worked before on anybody. I was the first guy it ever worked on. Wow. But when I was with him, all the other doctors were telling me, look, we're going to have to cut your foot off here.
Amputation was a real risk.
That was the deal. And so, but Bill Wagner said, I got an idea. I got a plan. And so when the other choice was having my foot cut off or let's try something new,
I'm open.
I'm with that guy.
So what was it? Well, I think of this phrase that's part of Stoicism called amor fati, which is like the love of fate.
Stoicism, Epictetus.
There you go.
Let's go. My guy. Stoicism is not my deal.
That's okay.
That's Kareem's deal. I'm spirited, enthusiastic, and I'm not afraid to let it show. So much of my structured life if there's such a thing for me. But
I've seen part of it.
It comes from, John Wooden, who wrote everything down.
Yeah.
I've had great coaches, and I don't rank, rate, or compare my coaches, but he was among the best.
Can I ask you a question about Coach Wooden?
Yeah.
There's one story
I was going to
wrote.
finish real quick. Hold your question.
Carry on.
But the cornerstones of his pyramid of success: industriousness and enthusiasm. Do you love what you're doing, and are you willing to work at it? Mm-hmm. And that's what I love to do. I love my job. I love my life. I love being alive, and I'm willing to work at it because I know the difference between being on top and being on the bottom, and I want to be on top. Your question, please, General.
Sure. You shared the story in your book when Nixon was in office,
Right.
Vietnam was raging, and Coach Wooden had recommended you write a letter. And
Right. This is after I got arrested at
Yes.
a peace rally.
Exactly.
And things didn't turn out quite the way we had anticipated. And I ended up in jail, and Coach Wooden driving me home. He suggested, instead of getting arrested, Bill, you should write letters. So I wrote a letter to Nixon on Coach Wooden's stationery. I didn't have stationery at the time.
The thing I find most fascinating is that story is, so you're in his office, and maybe you can just give some detail to it. He takes the card from you. He sees that it's his
It was in
stationery.
his locker room
Yeah.
at Pauley before practice, because I got the stationery from his secretary.
Right.
'Cause
Yes.
he had already gone for the day. He dropped me off back at the dorm. Instead of going into the dorm, I went down to his office from up on the hill where the dorms are, down past Drake Stadium, down past Pauley Pavilion, over to the J.D. Morgan Athletic Center where his office was, and his secretary, Aldine, was still there. And I asked her if she had any stationery. She said, "Sure, Bill, no problem." And so she handed me a piece of Coach Wooden's stationery. And I went back to the dorm and typed up this letter to Nixon and, outlined all the crimes against humanity and, the disastrous turn of events in Southeast Asia, and insisted that he bring all the boys. Now, there was no women in the service then, but bring all the boys back from Southeast Asia, immediately stop all the war. And then I finished the letter by demanding his resignation, and I thanked him in advance for his cooperation. And so I signed the letter. I go into the locker room the next day, and all the guys are there.
Yeah.
They had all been at the peace rally too, but I was the one that got arrested. So they, "Bill, what did Coach Wooden say?" "He told me to write a letter." "I did. Let's see it, Bill." They read it. They all signed it.
Yes.
And then I take it over to John Wooden, who's in his adjoining locker room. He has his own locker room with the coach as the coach, and we had exchanged some pleasantries at the beginning. And then I said, "Coach, I took your advice and I wrote a letter." I said, "Oh, great. Well, and I have it here, Coach, and I'd like you to sign it." And as a coach signer, because all the other guys in the team signed it.
Yeah.
And so he looked at it and he starts reading it, and it's got his name all over this piece of his stationery. And he just wants to tear this thing up.
Right.
But he hands it back to me in perfect condition, when he could have just crumpled it up and that'd be the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
But he handed it back to me and looked up at me with the sad, soft eyes of a father who had just been let down by his son. And that was the relationship that we had. He loved us. We didn't know it. We thought everybody had this perfect coach.
Yeah.
We had everybody had this perfect individual in their life that all they cared about was us, right? Because that was all of our lives growing up. And so he hands it back to me and he says, "Bill, I can't sign this. And you're not going to send this in, are you?" And I said, "Coach, I always do everything you tell me to do." And so I send it in, and sure enough, not too much longer, Nixon resigned. Now, I still write letters, man, but none with the success of that one.
That's such a great, I think that's a leadership story in itself, because
Right.
at the end, when he handed it back to you, in perfect condition, just that
Well,
really
he was a
resonated with me.
remarkable human being, and he was so much more than a basketball coach. And he was different, and I don't believe, and none of us really believe, that he knew what a great teacher he was. Because he taught us everything. What he really taught us how to do, he taught us how to learn and how to compete. And when you can learn and compete, you can do anything. he was so generous with everything in his life. He was not interested in acknowledgement, credit, recognition. He was not interested in stuff. He was not interested in material accumulation and physical gratification. He was interested in teaching. Now, he changed over time because he was the first great player. And when you're the great player,
Purdue,
your life is different. Martinsville High School too. And he would tell the stories about at Martinsville High School, which was a town of 4,000 people and had a gym that seated 10,000 people. And when his teams would play, every game was sold out at 10,000 people, and there'd be 15,000 more outside trying to get in. And that's how popular he was. That's how good he was. Wow. And then he got hurt. He couldn't play anymore after his college days were over. But everybody gets hurt, and everybody has to change. And so he became an English teacher. But he couldn't make enough money. They were paying him $3,500 to be the English teacher. He had a wife, Nell, and 2 children, Jim and Nan. And so he needed more money. So he went to the school principal and said, "Hey, man, I need more money." And the principal said, "That's all we got." And, this is in the early 1940s, late 30s. And that's all we got, $3,500 for the year. So Coach Wooden said, "Well, how about this? How about I'll become the athletic director, I'll become the baseball coach, and I'll become the basketball coach. And if you pay me $1,500 more for the year for all those other jobs, including my English salary, I'll have $5,000 for the year, and I believe we can make it on that." Wow. And so the principal said fine, and he went on and did quite well for himself. But it was never about money for him. Mm-hmm. The biggest salary that he ever made at UCLA as the coach was $32,500 for the year.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm watching the time. You've got a schedule. I'm gonna attempt the impossible. I'm gonna ask you for one book recommendation, but a very serious one.
They're all serious.
This is especially serious. I had some friends that were into the Grateful Dead at the very tail end, kind of the mid 90s. And I never was. If I was going to dig into one book about
Dennis McNally's The Long Strange Trip.
The Long Strange Trip.
Dennis McNally.
Okay, that's the one.
He's a long-time publicist. There's no band has had more written material generated about them than the Grateful Dead.
Right, I know.
And then no band has had more original artwork created. And there's an endless accumulation of stuff that you can learn about the Grateful Dead, including go on Sirius Radio, channel 23. It used to be channel 32, but now it's channel 23. And they just play all the music, and there's commentary, and the guys they have, Gary and David, on there who do the commentary, David Lemieux, who's the archivist, and the history out there. And then when you get a little taste and a little flavor, then come on tour.
Okay.
And the tour is going to start up. And they just announced the final tour. And I just made all the commercials for the upcoming final tour.
Okay.
And it's, but the Grateful Dead have been hugely important, impactful, influential, inspirational in my life. And I always I do a lot of mentoring for young people who are coming up trying to make it. And I also do a ton of mentoring for people who are facing health challenges, mental health challenges, all the things that I've already gone through. The best coach to have is someone who's on the way back from where you want to go.
Yeah.
And so I always mention to young people who are coming and want to make it, want to be a part of something, to find something, whatever it is. For me, it was the Grateful Dead. A community, a culture, a group that's bigger than you are and will be there for when times are tough. Yeah. You find yourself in times of trouble. The community will be there to help you. Yeah. And when I first went, when I was 15 years old in 1967, and I got there and I had no idea what to expect. I'd heard them on the radio, and it sounded super fun. And I got there and I got to the front, and everybody was so happy, and everybody was just like having so much fun. And so there was just so much hope, optimism, and positive vibes. And I just said, this is really cool. And this is what I want to do. And now I'm going to say it's 55 years later and more than 1,000 concerts later. I'm still here and I'm still going. And Lori and I, we've already blocked out most of the summer tour for next year and 2023, and we'll be there. Starts in LA.
So it's in LA.
Ends in San Francisco.
Okay.
And they go pretty much everywhere in between. And Boulder and the Gorge and Chicago Wrigley Field. And they'll be playing in New York and Boston and Saratoga and a lot of places and a lot of concerts and Dead and Company. Yeah, man. The bus came by and I got on. It's where it all began. It was Cowboy Neil at the wheel on a bus to Never Ever Land. When you get confused, listen to the music play. We used to play for silver. Now we play for life. Life seldom turns out the way it does in a song, but once in a while you get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right. I used to be a lost sailor, away too long at sea, drifting too far from the shore. Now I'm a tiger in a trance, a saint of circumstance. I sure don't know what I'm going for, but I'm going to go for it for sure. The first days are the hardest days. Don't worry. It'll be all right. But when life looks like Easy Street, there's danger at your door. Standing on the moon. It's a lovely view from heaven, but I'd rather be with you. I'd rather be with you. It's endless. And what Robert Hunter, what John Barlow, what Jerry and Bob, Phil, Mickey, Bill Kreutzmann, all the different piano players, Pigpen, and Keith and Brent and Bruce and Vince and now Jeff Chimente, what all these guys have done. I mean, they have addressed every issue, but all the great musicians do that. Bob Dylan, Neil Young, Bruce Springsteen, the Beach Boys. I mean, they lived their lives. They wrote these songs to us, for us, and about us. Mm-hmm. So listen to those songs because they're more relevant today than ever before, and it's just fantastic.
All right.
I'm the luckiest dude in the world.
Well, I feel like I'm the luckiest dude, and if I don't get you out of here on time, we're both going to be in trouble.
By, we will survive. We are alive. Yeah. And we are owed nothing, but we must deliver value first. Thank you for having me,
General.
You. I'm reporting for duty.
All right then, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my one-on-one conversation with Mr. Bill Walton. And if you are interested in seeing clips of that conversation in video format to review again or share with your team, you can find that on YouTube at Bradley Hartman & Co. And while you're there, subscribe. We're putting more and more videos up when we capture a video along with these podcasts we are recording. Our goal here is to make this the best podcast you listen to. So if you have ideas to make it better, suggestions for topics or guests, do not hesitate to email me directly at bradley@bradleyhartmanandco.com. I would like to thank our sponsor, Capital One Trade Credit. If you're interested in growing top-line revenue by leveraging a state-of-the-art digital platform that's fully customizable with a team behind the scenes to make implementation easy for you, you would be interested in learning more about Capital One Trade Credit. That's all I've got here. As always, thank you for listening. Your time and attention is valuable, and I appreciate that. And thank you for helping us grow this podcast. We're going to close out like we always do with our leadership mantra. You, my friend, are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.